My name is Rachel. I am 29 years old, and I work as a 911 dispatcher. Last spring, I attended my cousin's engagement party at a rooftop venue downtown. I wore a navy blue dress I had owned for 3 years, and I sat quietly near the end of the long table. Then my cousin stood up, pointed at me, and laughed in front of everyone. "That's my cousin Rachel," she announced to her fiancé's entire family. "Don't ask her about her job. She just sits in a room and answers phone calls." A few people smiled politely. One of her fiancé's uncles even chuckled. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at my glass and kept my expression calm. But then, across the table, my cousin's future father-in-law stopped laughing. He set his drink down slowly and looked directly at me. His eyes narrowed slightly, the way someone looks when a memory is trying to surface. He leaned forward just a little. "Wait," he said quietly. "Are you the one who—" He stopped mid-sentence. The table went completely still. Before I tell you what he remembered, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Fathe Stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me tell you everything. The party was held on the rooftop of a hotel in the River North neighborhood of Chicago. It was a Saturday evening in late April, and the weather had finally turned warm enough for people to stand outside in sleeveless dresses without shivering. String lights ran the length of the space, and tall glass vases filled with white flowers sat in the center of every table. The skyline was visible beyond the edge of the rooftop, and the whole thing looked like something out of a magazine. My cousin Brooke had always been good at making things look beautiful. That had been true since we were children. She knew exactly how to arrange a room, how to dress for an occasion, how to say the right things to the right people. Growing up, she was the cousin everyone talked about at Thanksgiving. Brooke made the honor roll. Brooke got a scholarship. Brooke landed a job at a marketing firm downtown before she even graduated college. I heard her name spoken with a certain admiration that I never quite understood how to earn for myself. We were raised in different parts of the same city. Her family lived on the north side, in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets and good public schools. My mother and I lived further south, in a smaller apartment, in a neighborhood that required a little more patience and a little more caution. We saw each other at holidays and family reunions, always politely, always with a distance that nobody ever named out loud, but everyone seemed to understand. I had never been close with Brooke. Not because of any single argument or falling out, but because we were simply different people who had grown up wanting different things. Brooke wanted recognition. She wanted to be seen walking into rooms and have people notice. I had spent most of my adult life being invisible by preference. I became a 911 dispatcher at 24. It wasn't the career path anyone in my family had imagined for me. My aunt had asked once, not unkindly, whether I had considered going into something more visible. She meant well. I knew she did. But I had found something in that job that I couldn't explain to someone who hadn't sat in that chair. There is a particular kind of responsibility in being the first voice a person hears when their world is falling apart. You can't see them. You can't touch them. All you have is your voice and your training and whatever calm you can hold onto in the few seconds you have before things get worse. I loved that work. I still do. Brooke had gotten engaged to a man named Daniel 3 months before the party. Daniel was a financial analyst, well-dressed, soft-spoken, and clearly devoted to her. His family had flown in from various parts of the country for the engagement dinner. His parents, his older brother and sister-in-law, 2 uncles, an aunt, and a few family friends. From what I could observe in the first 20 minutes of the evening, they were warm people. His mother laughed easily. His father, a tall man named Robert with silver at his temples and quiet eyes, was the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. I had arrived a few minutes late because of a shift change at work. I wore my navy dress and carried a small card with a gift certificate inside. I found a seat near the far end of one of the long tables and settled in quietly. A few of my relatives nodded hello. One of my aunts squeezed my shoulder as she passed. The evening moved along the way these things do. Wine was poured, bread baskets appeared, and conversations broke into smaller clusters around the table. I was talking quietly with an older relative about her granddaughter's school play when Brooke stood up from her seat near the center of the table. She tapped the side of her champagne glass with a small spoon, and the high, clear ring of it silenced the nearby conversations one by one. "I want to introduce some of my family to Daniel's family," she said, smiling wide. "Since we're going to be spending a lot of time together from now on." She moved down the table, naming relatives and offering small details about each one. My aunt was a retired schoolteacher. My uncle had run a plumbing business for 30 years. Her older brother worked in real estate. Each introduction came with something warm and flattering. She was good at this. Then she reached me. "And this," she said, resting one hand briefly on my shoulder, "is my cousin Rachel." I looked up and smiled at the people across the table. Brooke tilted her head slightly and laughed. It was a light laugh, the kind meant to seem casual. "Don't ask her about her job," she said. "She just sits in a room and answers phone calls all day." A few people smiled. One of Daniel's uncles let out a short chuckle. Someone else made a small comment about that sounding easy. I didn't respond. I had learned years ago that engaging with Brooke in those moments never helped anything. She wasn't being cruel in the way a person is cruel when they're angry. She was being dismissive, which is its own quieter kind of unkindness. I simply kept my expression calm, looked down at my water glass, and let the moment pass. Brooke moved on to the next introduction. The table resumed its noise. I took a breath and reached for my fork. But across the table, something had shifted. Daniel's father, Robert, had not resumed his conversation. He was looking at me. Not the way people sometimes look when they're searching for something polite to say after an awkward moment. He was looking at me the way a person looks when they're standing in a room that feels familiar and they can't immediately explain why. His brow was slightly furrowed. His fork was held loosely in one hand but hadn't touched his plate. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I glanced away and picked at my food. But when I looked back a few minutes later, he was still doing it. His wife had said something to him, and he nodded and answered her, but his attention kept returning to me. The same quiet, searching expression. I looked away again and tried to focus on the conversation to my left. One of my relatives was describing a recent trip to Nashville. I listened and added a few words here and there. The band that had been playing softly near the far end of the rooftop finished one song and began another. Waiters moved between the tables with the next course. Everything on the surface looked like an ordinary celebration. But something underneath it had changed, and I couldn't quite name it. About 10 minutes later, Daniel leaned toward his father. "Dad, you okay? You've been quiet." Robert nodded slowly. "I'm fine," he said. But the way he said it, carefully and without full conviction, suggested he was still somewhere else in his mind. Daniel followed his father's gaze for a moment. Then he looked back. "What is it?" Robert set his fork down. He glanced around the table, then back at me, and then he spoke the sentence that stopped everything. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing me directly now, his voice measured and polite. "I don't want to interrupt the evening. But I have to ask you something." He paused. "About 2 years ago, were you working the overnight shift at the Chicago 911 Center on the near North Side?" The table around us quieted without anyone appearing to intend it. I felt my heart shift slightly in my chest. "Yes," I said carefully. "I've worked that dispatch center for 5 years. Robert exhaled. Long and slow, the way a person exhales when something they've been carrying finally settles. Daniel set down his glass. "Dad, what's going on?" Robert looked at his son for a moment, and then back at me. When he spoke again, his voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed. Something had come loose. 2 years ago, he said, my wife had a heart attack in our kitchen at 2 in the morning. The table went completely still. He continued, each sentence arriving with a weight that came from somewhere far back. I woke up and found her on the floor. I didn't know what was happening. I picked up the phone and called 911, and I could barely form a sentence. I was shaking so hard I dropped the phone twice. Nobody moved. The dispatcher who answered stayed on the line with me for 11 minutes until the paramedics arrived. He paused. She walked me through chest compressions. She told me exactly what to do and when to do it, and she kept her voice so calm that I was able to stay calm enough to follow her instructions. He looked at me steadily. She stayed on with me even after the paramedics arrived, until I told her my wife was being loaded onto the stretcher. He stopped. The doctors told us afterward that without those 11 minutes, my wife would not have made it to the hospital. Daniel's mother reached across and put her hand over her husband's. Robert looked at her for a moment, then looked back at me. "I have thought about that voice for 2 years," he said. "I never knew the name. They don't tell you. But I have thought about it every single day." He paused. "And sitting here tonight, listening to you speak, I know that voice." The silence at the table was the kind that has weight to it. I could feel every eye on me. I wasn't sure what to say. My hands were folded in my lap, and I kept them there. "I remember that call," I said quietly. "It was the truth. You don't forget the ones where you're doing compressions over the phone and you don't know yet how it ends. I remember because you never once let go of the phone. Even when you dropped it, you kept picking it back up." Robert closed his eyes for just a moment. His wife was sitting beside him, and she was crying without making any sound. "She's here," Robert said. "She's here at this table because of what you did." I shook my head slightly. "You did the work," I said. "I just talked you through it." "No," he said, and there was a firmness in it, not unkind but clear. "No. What you did that night was not small. Please don't call it small." Daniel had stood up from his chair. He walked around the edge of the table to where I was sitting, and he extended his hand. "I don't know what to say," he said. "I genuinely don't know what to say." I stood and shook his hand. He held it for a moment longer than a typical handshake, the kind of grip that is trying to communicate something that words haven't found yet. Around the table, people had begun to respond in small, quiet ways. One of Daniel's aunts had her hand over her mouth. 2 of my relatives were looking at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before, something that sat between astonishment and what I can only describe as recognition, like they were seeing a version of me that had always existed but that they hadn't known to look for. I sat back down slowly. I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. It has never suited me. I do better in the background, in the chair with a headset on, in the room where nobody can see my face. Brooke had not said anything. I noticed this without looking directly at her. The quality of silence at her end of the table was different from the silence everywhere else. The silence elsewhere was full. Hers was empty. She was sitting very still with her champagne glass held in both hands, and she was not looking at anything in particular. Robert spoke again, this time to the wider table. "When I heard the description just now," he said, nodding slightly toward Brooke, though without any hardness in his voice, "about someone who sits in a room and answers phone calls. I need to say something about that." He looked around at the people listening. The woman who stayed on the phone with me that night could have followed the protocol exactly, transferred the call, and moved on. That's all she was required to do. He paused. She did not do that. She stayed. She coached me through 15 months of grief, compressed into 11 minutes, without ever losing her composure. She kept me from falling apart at the exact moment that falling apart would have cost my wife her life. He looked back at me. "That is not answering a phone call," he said. "That is one of the bravest things one human being can do for another." The night did not end dramatically. There was no confrontation, no speech, no moment where anyone pointed a finger or raised their voice. The party returned, slowly, to being a party. The band started up again. The dessert course arrived. People shifted in their seats and found their conversations again, though the conversations were different now, quieter in some corners, more careful. Daniel's mother came around to my side of the table at one point during the dessert hour. She didn't make a production of it. She simply sat down in the empty chair next to mine and took both of my hands in hers and looked at me without speaking for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. I didn't know what to do with the weight of those 2 words coming from her. "I'm glad you're here," I said. It was the truest thing I could think of. She smiled and squeezed my hands once before going back to her seat. I stayed at the party for another hour. I said goodbye to the relatives I was close to, shook hands with Robert again, and hugged Daniel's mother once more before I left. She held on a little longer than I expected, the way a person holds on when they understand that some things cannot be fully expressed in words. Brooke was near the entrance when I was leaving. We made brief eye contact. She opened her mouth slightly, the way a person does when they're trying to find a sentence. But whatever she was reaching for didn't come. She closed her mouth again. I didn't need her to say anything. I didn't want an apology that had to be extracted by circumstance. I nodded at her, not coldly, just simply, and I walked to the elevator. On the drive home, I thought about the call. I remember the feeling of that night the way you remember a dream that left a mark even after the images have faded. The phone ringing at 2:17 in the morning. A man's voice, broken open with fear, saying his wife was on the floor and not moving. The way I had to slow my own breathing first, for 2 seconds, before I could be useful to him. The way he kept dropping the phone and picking it back up. The way, at the end, when the paramedics were there and he finally put the phone down, the line had gone quiet and I had stayed with it for another few seconds before disconnecting, just in case. I had never known what happened after that. You almost never do. The call ends, the next call begins, and the outcome belongs to someone else's story. You do your job and you let go because you have to, because the job continues and it requires your full attention and there is no space in that work for wondering. But sitting in my car outside my apartment that night, I allowed myself a few minutes to feel the fullness of it, that the man on the other end had not let go of the phone, that his wife had lived, that she had been sitting across from me at a table with string lights and white flowers, watching her son celebrate an engagement 2 years later. I had spent 5 years being told, in small ways and sometimes not so small ways, that my job was a background job. A necessary one, fine, but not the kind of career that earned a story at a dinner party. Not the kind of work that got mentioned with pride. I had made my peace with that, mostly. You find your meaning in the work itself and you stop waiting for the outside world to assign it. But Robert's voice that night was something I will carry for a long time. Not because I needed validation, though I'd be dishonest if I said hearing those words meant nothing. I'll carry it because of what it confirmed about something I had believed quietly for 5 years without much evidence to point to. The job matters. The voice on the other end of the line matters. The 11 minutes matter. Not because someone famous said so, or because a room full of people finally turned to look, but because somewhere, a woman who should have died in her kitchen on a Tuesday night in February was alive to sit next to her husband at a rooftop party in April and watch her son become engaged. That is the whole story. There is a version of this night where Brooke's comment had been allowed to define me, where I had stayed quiet, gone home, and folded the moment away into the same drawer where I keep all the other small dismissals. I have a full drawer. Most people who work jobs that don't come with titles do. But that night, I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to argue or defend or prove. The truth had simply been present all along, and it found its own way into the room. I don't know if Brooke understood what happened that night the way I understood it. I don't know what she said to Daniel on the drive home, or what she thought about in the days after. We are not close enough for that kind of conversation, and I don't expect we will be. What I do know is that the people in that room heard something true, and that truth had nothing to do with titles or salary or which career sounds impressive at a dinner party. It had to do with what a person does when someone else is in the worst moment of their life, and all they have is a voice on the other end of a phone line. I got home that night, changed out of my navy dress, and made a cup of tea. I had a shift the next morning at 6. I set my alarm and went to bed. And when my shift started the next day, I sat down in my chair, put on my headset, and answered the first call. Because that is what I do. And that night, an entire table of people learned something about the work that happens in rooms they will never see, by people they will never recognize walking past them on the street. The person who answers when you call. The person who keeps their voice steady so that yours can fall apart. The person who stays on the line. There is no such thing as just answering a phone call. Not when the person on the other end is on their knees on a kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, and the next 11 minutes are the only ones that matter.